Hello, everybody. Our next speaker is Feride, who is going to speak to us about stitching lives, making place. Thank you for.
Thank you. Do you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I mean, there are lots of things happening in Hackney today. Festivals, people are out, and thank you for making an effort to be with us today. Today, I want to tell a different story of Hackney. It is not about regeneration. It is not about urban lifestyle or creative industry. This is a story of Turkish Kurdish woman who arrived in Hackney from 1980s onwards as workers, as political refugees, as migrant family members who helped shape the borough in different ways, which remain invisible today and invisible from official histories. The photographs that help tell this story came from different sources, from local photography artists, community archivists, and local residents. I would like to thank Ellen Denny. Is he around today? He said he was going to come. Hello. And Vepi Koca for generously allowing me to use their photographs. As I said, this is a story about a Turkish Kurdish woman and the making of Hackney as we know it today. And some of the Turkish Kurdish women are around today, and thanks for them for joining us today. This story matters to me. I am in some of the photographs, as you see. This story matters to me because my relationship with Hackney has never been only a researcher. I worked in Hackney, I walked in Hackney, I organized in Hackney, demonstrated in Hackney, and created within the communities. The images here reflect some of those journeys. On the left is the poster of Hidden Voices, the Making of Hackney Today, which I organized in 2022 at Newington Green Meeting Hall. The exhibition and the community project, which actually included 3 days event, film screening, music, talks, as well as audio and visual exhibition, focused on Turkish Kurdish women's experiences of placemaking, migration, belonging, and everyday life in Hackney. One of the aims was to make their history visible, their voices to be heard. The images in the middle are from bookbinding and zine making workshop connected to this exhibition. Many of you would recognize Tamara Stoll, who is again local photography artist, who supported me and led the facilitation of that workshop. These workshops were not only about producing books or binding books. They were about creating community archives collectively, allowing women to document their stories, bring them together and bind them, keep them for themselves, or pass it on to the community organization so we can have archives, because we have nothing in archives. At the bottom left is a photograph connected to my years working with Image Women Center. where I worked alongside with migrant and refugee women, supported my fellow migrant women experiencing domestic violence, experiencing social exclusion, mental health issues, housing and welfare rights. Spaces like Image were not simply service providers. They were also places of solidarity, survival, friendship, and political organizing. Image is on the border of Hackney and Islington. It is on Boltzmann Road. Um, and on the right is a very ordinary image of me doing park run uh, in Hackney marshes. I included it because belonging is also built through everyday routines and repeated encounters with the place. So this talk emerges both from academic research and from lived experience, community memory, and long-term engagement with the borough. I want to begin by asking you to imagine Hackney in the late 1980s. Imagine Wigley Road Market, the smells of spices, um, bread, maybe roasted chestnuts. Women carrying shopping bags after 10 hours shift in garment factories. Imagine many different languages mingled at the same time. Traders shouted words that may not be intelligible for English speakers, yet for others, they were the words that allowed them to navigate in the market, feel a sense of belonging within. Sewing machines still running late into the evening in upstairs workshops of Shopping Village on Ridley Road. Imagine on Kingston Road, small cafes full of political conversations, loneliness, homesickness, and hope. For many Turkish Kurdish migrants, Hackney was not simply a place to live. It became a place where survival had to be rebuilt from scratch. And women were central to this rebuilding. This talk also matters because the history of Hackney cannot be separated from the histories of migrant women, migrant laborers. The images on this slide represent some of the many ways Turkish Kurdish women have shaped the life in the borough, economically, socially, politically, and culturally. The photograph on the right remind us the garment industry that once dominated large part of Hackney's economy. Thousands of migrant women worked in textile workshops, factories across Dalston, Huggeston, Stoke Newington, Mile Street, often under extremely difficult conditions. Their labor sustained families, supported local economies, and helped build the foundations of multicultural Hackney. But from the 1990s onwards, many of these factories began to close as manufacturing declined and urban redevelopment accelerated. The image in the middle reflects an important shift that followed. Many families moved from factory into small scale entrepreneurship, opening cafes, markets, stalls, restaurants, grocery shops, 24-hour grocery shops, and takeaway businesses. These family run spaces became both economic survival strategies and important social spaces within the community. Women played a central role in this transition. Often their labor remained invisible because it was folded into family businesses, working long hours behind the scenes. Yet these businesses transformed the streets and everyday culture of Hackney and contributed to vibrant food culture the borough is known for today. And the image on the left reminds us that women were not only workers and carers, they were also political actors and organizers. Turkish Kurdish women in Hackney have long been involved in anti-racist struggles, campaign against violence against women, refugee solidarity, labor organizing, and community activism. Too often, these histories remained fragmented, hidden, or absent from official narratives of London. Once a Kurdish woman who had arrived as a refugee, told me her story. She first worked as a machinist in a garment workshop and later opened a restaurant in Stoke Newington. She taught the trade to her partner, yet gradually lost ownership of that shop. Her partner still had the cafés in Hackney. She told me most of the restaurants, most of the cafes, most of the businesses you see on Kingston Road was initially built on women's labor. Yet today, that labor is largely invisible. So this story is also about memory, whose histories become visible. And when we look closely at Hackney's streets markets, workshops, and community centers, we begin to see migrant women not simply as residents of the borough, but as active makers of its social and cultural life. I want to pause for a moment on this building because for me it captures many of the themes of this story. This building stands in Shackleville Green area, near Dalston, Stoke Newington. Today it is known as Cotton Lofts and has been converted into luxury residential apartments. But the photograph shows the building during an earlier period when it was occupied by Rona Fashion's House and George Gown Ltd, both connected to Hackney Garments and rug trade industries. The building itself dates back to 1932. It was originally constructed as a print house for Albert Works, printers Henry Heasley, and designed by the architects Hopton and Pori. Later, like many industrial buildings in East London, it became connected to the garment industry that employed large numbers of migrant workers, including Turkish and Kurdish women. Behind these walls, there were sewing machines, long hours, and precarious labor. Women worked in places like this while raising their children. After school and on some Saturdays, children often played between sewing machines and fabric piles, while their mothers continued working long hours. Today, the building has become part of a very different urban landscape. Loft apartments, marketed through the language of creativity, heritage, and urban lifestyle. Whose So this building allow us to think about how cities transform. It also asks whose labor becomes invisible when cities transform. And what happens when spaces once associated with working class or migrant labor are turned into symbols of urban regeneration and gentrification. For me, buildings like this are not only architecture, they are archives of labor, migration, memory, and urban change. This talk draws on oral histories, walking interviews, community archives, and years of community research based in Hackney. Some of these stories come from formal interviews, and others emerged while we were walking on the streets, markets, sitting in cafes, and visiting neighborhoods together. Because memory is often attached to a place, we did go along interviews. A cafe, a street corner, a market stall, or even the smell of food can carry histories that official archives do not record. Today, I want to bring some of those histories into this room. Part of my research, I used what we call counter mapping or community mapping. These are not conventional maps concerned with exact measurements or official geography. Instead, they map lived experience. They trace memory, emotion, movement, labor, fear, belonging, political struggle, and everyday survival through space. This map was hand drawn by Leila during one of the go along interviews in Hackney. Leila is a Kurdish woman who arrived in 1988 as a political refugee. She came from a very small village in eastern Turkey. And she had a very strict family. Before arriving London, she never even been to a town or city. Her father was very strict. After primary school, she wasn't allowed to go to secondary school. Um, her main responsibilities was looking after her siblings. She had 7 other siblings and helping her mother with the household work. When she became 18, 17 towards 18, her father tried to marry her a man nearly 30 years older than her. Her brother was a university student, older than her, and socialist, intervened the situation. He confronted their father, who insisted that he could not break the promise he had made to the village elder. Eventually, her brother came up with another solution. The family would say that Leila had run away to join her sisters and extended family members already living in London. With her brothers, as long as she wasn't around, the father was okay with it because the shame is as long as the shame disappears, it doesn't matter. So he had to agree with the plan. With her brother's support, Leila arrived in Hackney in 1988. The very next day, she started working as a finisher, cutting loose threads from garments in a workshop on Ridley Road, where her older sister and other family members worked. Through factory work, she met other women involved in political activism and community organizing. She started going to the meetings after work. Over time, she began participating in meetings, demonstrations, and political events, while also encouraging fellow workers to become involved. Later, she became known within the community by the nickname Striker Leila, as she was very successful in mobilizing fellow workers. So when Leila drew this map, She was not trying to produce a technically accurate street map. She mapped the places that mattered in her everyday life, the workshop where she worked, community spaces that she visited, political gathering points, the routes she walked through the neighborhoods. The map, therefore, becomes more than a map of streets. It becomes a map of labor, migration, memory, and political awakening in Hackney. You can see Ridley Road Market running through in the center of the map. Around it, there are garment workshops. And towards the end of the very end of the Ridley Road Market, there is Turkish Food Center. It is still there, and it became a very big food center. And initially, when the first refugees arrived, Turkish Food Center actually played a role of keeping their money safe. So, all workers on Friday, they were giving some of the wages to him. The owner was called Topalali. They were giving it to him. He had a book to register everyone's money because nobody had bank accounts, and the flats were constantly robbed by the locals and their community members even. So they couldn't keep the money at home. And that food store actually played a role, a very important role in the community. And it was trusted by everyone. It was trusted by women. It was even not from their village, not their kinship, because trust generally around that time established through those premises, even though the owner of the place wasn't one of theirs, that's how they say, because on the day they asked their money back to send back home to support the other family members, he immediately returned the money. So that is the trust, how it was established. So that is Turkish food store. And next to it, we used to have Cemevi, Alevi Community Center. It is not there anymore. They moved to Wood Green. And the arrows drawn across the map are especially important because they trace movement and collective action. Leila used these arrows to remember the route workers took during the Bacton fashion strike in 1990. At the time, Bacton Fashion on Summerford Grove employed many Turkish and Kurdish workers, including large number of women. Workers faced long hours, difficult conditions, low wages, and insecurity, especially the production was seasonal production. And towards the end of the season, factories started to lay off the workers. So around in 1990, workers at Bacton Fashion switched off their machines and walked out together. Around 400 workers from across Hackney joined the protest. It was recorded as the biggest and longest strike without the help of trade union in Hackney. It took 4 days and then months. The factory had to close, and they opened it in somewhere else in East London. The strike was remembered not only politically, but spatially. Through roads walked, workshops occupied, and collective movement through the streets of Hackney. The map, therefore, becomes much more than illustration. It becomes an alternative archive. an archive of labor, resistance, migration, and women's political presence. Counter maps like this enable us to see Hackney differently, not simply a borough shaped by regeneration and urban development, but as a place produced through movement, labor, solidarity, and collective struggle. To understand how Turkish Kurdish women settled in Hackney, we first need to understand both the conditions they were escaping and the kind of borough Hackney was at the time. Large numbers of Turkish Kurdish migrants arrived in London from the late 1970s, particularly during 80s and 90s. Some arrived as political refugees after the 1980 military coup in Turkey. Others fled political violence, persecution, imprisonment, war, and the destruction of Kurdish villages. Some came through labor migration or family reunification. But when they arrived in Hackney, Hackney was already a diaspora place. Hackney had been shaped over the generations by Jewish, Caribbean, Asian, Irish, Cypriot communities, and many others who had settled there over time. By the 80s, Hackney was also one of the poorest boroughs in the UK, not in London, in the UK. Housing conditions were very difficult. Unemployment was high, especially among the Black and migrant communities. The unemployment was extremely high, and the borough was experiencing neglect and investment. Yet, for many newly arrived migrants, Hackney also offered possibilities of survival. Housing was cheaper than in many other boroughs, and some migrant families found accommodation through squatting network and informal community connections. The Squatters Association at that time produced a leaflet on Turkish, explaining the rights of the people who squatted the place, to give information to these newly arrived refugees and migrants. Textile workshops across Dalston, Haggerston, and all other places provided work. Even if conditions were difficult and poorly paid, many women I interviewed told me that they started working almost immediately after arriving, sometimes the very next day. They didn't need English language skills. Many of small workshops were owned by Turkish-speaking Cypriots who arrived before them, or they employed Turkish-speaking supervisors and machinists who translated for newly arrived workers. One woman, I will name it as Birsen, who was already university graduate when she arrived, was working one of the workshops on the first floor of Simpson House on Kingsland Road. They were sewing Metropolitan Police uniforms. She described the factory being like the United Nations. The workers from Bangladesh, Kurdish, Indian, African, none were speaking English. I asked how they communicated with each other. She said, in quote, factory was like a divided city, and every community had their own ghettos. Each community had their own corner and had a translator for themselves. For Turkish and Kurdish, there was a very young woman from Cyprus spoken broken English, a broken Turkish. They just managed to communicate. Somehow they did. During the breaks, everybody was sitting with their own mates and speaking in their own languages. No interaction at all. The work related communications, such as handling over a bundle or asking something to workshop managers, were done through body language or making sounds. They did have their own gestures for communication. Knocking on the machine 3 times meant the garment are ready for finisher. The factory was producing thousands and thousands of clothes without verbal communication. End quote. This is Birsen's experience, but many other women said over the time when they worked in those factories, they started slowly making friendship with the others. And Leila, our striker Leila, immediately when she started, she made friendship with others. So not everybody's experience is same, but Birsen's story is really shocked me in the way that, you know, so many migrant workers, like they acting like machines somehow. Although Britain's textile industry was already declining, Turkish and Kurdish migrants' labor continued to sustain many small workshops across East London. In practice, many migrant and racialized communities were largely left to survive on their own. There was often a turning of a blind eye towards unregistered workshops with extremely poor working conditions. Following the recommendations of Lord's Karma report in 1981 after the riots on elimination of social exclusion, Hackney Council also encouraged Black and minority ethnic business ownership, and in some cases allowed unsuitable or semi-derelict spaces to be converted into textile workshops. The subcontracting firms in the fashion industry, they supported opening small workshops. They actually gave the second-hand machines. Hackney Council gave the space, so everybody can actually open a workshop. The main point was having an access to the migrant skilled workers. And generally it is done through the kinship. So many Turkish and Kurdish men became owner of the workshops. Some factory owners even encouraged relatives and community members in Turkey to learn how to sew before migrating to London because labor was constantly needed. It triggered flow migration. Women often worked 12 and 14 hours a day on piece rates, meaning the faster, the longer they worked, the more they earned. Behind the image of multicultural Hackney were long hours, repetitive labor, exhaustion, and insecurity. When I look at this image, I do not simply see a crowd. I see people trying to rebuild their life under certain conditions. Settlement in Hackney was shaped not only by not only by hardship, but also by local solidarities. By the 80s, Hackney already had strong tradition of anti-racist organizing, trade union activism, squatting movements, feminist organizing, and community campaigns. You know, we had uh, park festivals, um, Pride happening in Victoria Park, you know, homeless festival happened in Clissold Park. So Hackney was a vibrant borough at that time. For newly arrived Turkish Kurdish migrants, these networks became important sources of support. Of the key organizations, for example, from Turkey was Halkevi, one of the key organizations. Based in Simpson House, nearly in Stoke Newington, on, I think, Stoke Newington High Street. Founded by left-wing migrants who had arrived before and after 1980s military coup in Turkey, Halkevi became much more than a political organization. Through organizations like Halkevi, connections were also made with local anti-racist groups, trade unions, churches, left organizations, and neighborhood campaigns already active in Hackney. These solidarities mattered enormously. They helped newly arrived migrants find housing, work, legal advice, schools, and emotional support. One of the buildings that was squatted by the squatters turned into a refugee center giving legal advice. So there were lots of support from the local communities. In many ways, survival became collective because for uh, Turkish Kurdish refugees arriving in big numbers boosted the local uh, opposition groups, all these groups, and they were supporting each other in that sense. Um, Despite poverty, racism, and difficult living conditions, many local residents and community organizations welcomed and supported newly arrived migrants and refugees. Refugees were often seen and treated as political subjects, people shaped by war, dictatorship, political violence, resistance, rather than simply passive recipients of aid. Over the years, however, public and policy narratives around refugees have shifted significantly. Refugees increasingly came to be represented not as self-determining political subjects, but as vulnerable objects in need of management, empowerment, or control. And in today's increasingly hostile climate, they are argued to be criminals or threats. This photograph is actually taken from inside Simpson House before Halkevi, Turkish Kurdish community, is actually located in that building. Simpson House was originally built in 1929 by the same architects, Hobden and Corey. And it was um, accepted to be a large Art Deco model factory. Um, and it became a major space for the British menswear production, later associated with Ducks Trousers brand. They had a place in Piccadilly Street, called Simpsons and Piccadilly. So the Simpson House was their production space. Over 2,000 workers worked there before closing in 1982. Later, part of this former factory became important for Turkish Kurdish community life in Hackney, including Halkevi, while the wider building and surrounding area continued to connect garment labor, political organizing, everyday migrant social life. It was a social, cultural, and practical meeting point for the community. People came there for advice, language classes, translation, childcare information, simply to meet with others and happy. Inside, there were meeting room, advice room, a tea house, later was a restaurant, a theater hall that was built by by its members. Even there was a hairdresser who was a refugee who arrived at that time with the skills but didn't have money to open any place. So Halkivi actually hosted that hairdresser. And that hairdresser has a shop on Stoke Newington High Street now called Haidar. And a big sitting area in the middle. Above these social spaces were, so top floors were garment workshops. Let me go back. So top floors were garment workshops where many women spent long hours working on sewing machines. Friday were especially important because at that time, the payment, it was a payment day. 3 o'clock, the factories shut, the workers were given their wages, and many women came down to Halkevi, where the sitting area is, meet with friends, drink tea, share stories of work, loneliness, separation, and loss. So work, politics, friendship, and community life often existed side by side in the same community, or in the same neighborhood, sometimes in the same building. The garment industry relied heavily on women's labor because culturally it is seen as a woman's work. Many women learned machining skills quickly through relatives, neighbors. Women became the main breadwinners. Their wages paid rent, looked after the family, but also built the community. People even told me that there were almost as many men's cafes in the area as garment workshops. While women worked upstairs on sewing machines, many men gathered in cafes, political spaces, and community organizations. This does not mean that men didn't work. They worked every now and then whenever they found job, occasional job. But women's wage labor became central to household survival. But an important gender shift also took place. When the factories closed, the new family businesses opened. Women lost this paid work, wages. They became unpaid workers in those small family businesses. Women continued to work intensely within family businesses, this time unpaid, but much of their labor became folded into the family life. Even today, Turkish and Kurdish businesses continue to shape much of Dalston's food scene. These restaurants, cafes, bakeries, takeaway shops attract visitors from well beyond borough. Many late night and 24-hour businesses run by Turkish and Kurdish communities help make parts of Hackney feel vibrant, lively, socially active, long before the area became fashionable. Um, the experiences of Turkish and Kurdish women in Hackney were also shaped by wider political and economic changes taking place in Britain during the, I think the next slide should be, during the 1980s and 90s. This was the era of Thatcherism, marked by cuts, privatization, weakening the trade unions, growing inequality. Hackney was heavily affected by these changes. So at the same time, the manufacturing is finishing, closing. At the same time, immigration systems were becoming increasingly restrictive and hostile. Racism, police surveillance, anti-immigration rhetoric were part of the everyday life. The images on this slide reflect some of those political tensions and forms of resistance. The photographs from Hackney show demonstrations taking place around um, Kingston Road and Dalston during the 1980s and 1990s. You can see slogans such as "No workers are illegal," "Demand for workers' rights." The image from the International Women's Day March also reminds us that migrant women were not only were not simply passive victims of these political conditions, but they organized around workers' rights, violence against women, dictatorship, gender equality, asylum and immigration. Many women I interviewed described how political activism became part of everyday life in Hackney. So women often became mediators between family, state, schools, welfare institutions, and healthcare systems. Yet despite these pressures, migrant women continued organizing, supporting families. So from 1980s onwards, the woman continuously involved in campaigns, different campaigns. Many women first became active through mixed community organizations, but then later they created their own woman-only spaces. The image on the right shows Londra Kadın Grubu, one of the first established small women's group in Turkish among the Turkish-speaking women, including women from Cyprus. These organizations created spaces where women could speak openly about issues often silenced within the community, including domestic violence, economic independency, isolation, unequal gender relations. One important example was women were also central to establishing different community organizations. One of them was Mini Kardeş Nursery. It is on Bosphorus Road, still, and it became a children's center. It's a very established nursery. Initially was set up by small group of women who try to organize the childcare among themselves. Today, organizations like Image continue to provide professional support, but these are not only service providers, they are also places of solidarity. The It is also important to remember that Turkish Kurdish women contributed not only small businesses, community organizations, but also to Hackney's wider cultural life. For example, when the Arkola Theatre was first established on Arkola Street, in a former garment workshop building, much of the renovation work was carried out collectively by community members, including many women volunteering their time and labor. The cafe space within the theater was also initially run on a voluntary basis by Turkish and Kurdish women. Similarly, the Turkish Film Festival in London was run over 10 years by a Turkish woman and became an important cultural space for migrant communities, especially during the early years before satellite television, and most screenings were sold out. Rio Cinema was at risk at that time, risk of closure. And these festivals boosted its income. Also, at a time when many migrants could not easily go back to Turkey and watch some of the movies, um, the festival created important sense of connection memory. This is the last one. Okay. Sorry. This is the last. Yeah. This is the last one. So this slide brings us to the more recent story of Hackney: gentrification, redevelopment, and displacement. The images here are Morning Lane and Hackney Walk, an area that captures very clearly the transformation of Hackney's industrial and working class landscape. Morning Lane was once associated with car mechanics, railway arches, small fashion ateliers, workshops, storage spaces, and local businesses. It was not polished or branded. It was part of the everyday working landscape of Hackney. Now it became a fashion quarter. Actually, it is that now. Some time ago, it became a fashion quarter, also known as Hackney Walk. Was a major regeneration project launched after 2011, and 100 million of public and private investment backed the project. The project redevelopment of the former railway arches, workshops, and industrial spaces into luxury fashion and retail district. The area was promoted as East London's version of designer shopping centers. Um, However, the fashion quarter largely failed. Luxury brands struggled to attract enough customers, rent remained high, so they left. Um, Today, the area still reflects this uncertainty, and it is called Ghost Town. One of the images shows the factory, which is on Shacklewell Lane. I think it is the top bit factory left on. No. It is on Shacklewell Lane, and it is again used to be a garment making workshops. Now it is very luxurious studios. So what I am trying to say is that when people speak about Hackney today, the focus is often on regeneration, creative industries, and urban renewal. But behind these visible transformations are older histories of migrant labor, care, and collective survival. And to understand Hackney differently, we must listen to the woman whose lives stitched the borough together.